Hello, everybody, and welcome back to day 5 and the final day of the European Spectrum Management Conference. I know that many of you have already been with us for an hour or so to take part in the 3 showcase sessions that we've already had taking place today. So I hope that you really have all enjoyed those. I've been preparing here for the first session, so I haven't had a chance to watch much of that, but I've heard from my colleagues that there's been some really good discussion and some excellent presentation things going on there. So I hope you have all enjoyed those. So just maybe to recap on what we've had with those showcase sessions and what we've got coming up later today as well. So the 3 showcases we've just had, as I said, many of you will know, we've had a showcase from Plum Consulting looking at considering economic and social values of spectrum, a showcase from Ericsson looking at 5G technologies, demonstrations of 5G technologies, and from Microsoft looking at the potential of unlicensed spectrum. So if you did miss those, or if you wanted to catch up on either of the 2 that you weren't able to watch, as they were all obviously taking place in parallel, then a reminder again that the recordings of those showcases and all other event sessions that are taking place and that have taken place as part of the event will be available for you to watch again via the Forum Europe YouTube page. So you should have all received an email on Friday with the links of how to access these. And a final email will also be sent out to you again after the close of the event with all of the info on these sessions. And now we are back here on the main stage for the final plenary session of the conference, which is going to be focusing, as you can see on the slide here next to me, on the future of the UHF band. Now, this is a band and a topic that was voted for by all of you guys during the sessions last week as likely to be the most prominent issue ahead of WRC 23. So we're really looking forward to what I'm sure are going to be an excellent session and to what our panelists and speakers have to say on that. And very shortly, I'll be welcoming Mark Colville from Analysys Mason to the stage, who's going to be introducing and moderating that session. But just before I do, I wanted to let you know what else we have going on today following this panel session that we're about to start now. Because we have 2 final opportunities for all of you out there to get involved and to give your thoughts and opinions on the topics that we've discussed today and the rest of the event. So first of all, from 3:45 until 4:15 European time, Central European time, we have our Have Your Say session. So this will be similar to the sessions we've had for anyone who was here last week. It's a chance for you all to talk about the issues that have been covered in the session today, to bring your audio and video feed live, and to give your thoughts and your comments on the session specifically that's happened today on the UHF session. And then following that, we have what we're calling It's a Wrap, which is our closing ceremony for the event. And that's being hosted by Broadcast Network Europe. And during that, the closing ceremony, a number of our speakers and other key stakeholders will talk through what their overall conclusions have been from the conference, from the session today and from the sessions last week. And then we're also going to be asking you the same questions and inviting you all to post details of what your key takeaways have been during that session as well. And we're going to be using some of these comments that are made during the session there to circulate after the event as part of the post-event materials that we're putting together. So please do get involved. And in addition to that, we're also going to be having some live music taking place here on the main stage as the backdrop for that opportunity for you to put your comments up online. And we're going to be announcing which of you has won an iPad in the event competition that we've had running throughout the duration of the event. So lots going on. But first of all, as I said, we do have initially our panel on the future of the UHF band. So I would now like, without further ado, to welcome Mark to the stage. Mark, welcome. So Mark is going to be moderating the session, introducing our speakers, and first of all, providing an introduction himself to the issues that are going to be covered. So Mark, welcome again, and over to you.
Thank you, Dan. And good day to everyone, and welcome to this panel session on the future of the UHF, which, like Dan, I'm very much looking forward to. So if we could bring up the first slide, please, Dan. By way of introduction, my first slide here is explaining that the European Parliament decision from 2017 requires that the sub-700 megahertz spectrum, so that's 470 to 694 megahertz, is to remain available for terrestrial broadcasting and PMSE until at least 2030. And in that context, we're looking here at what the future of the sub-700 megahertz band is likely to hold for Europe. Well, first thing to say is that there continues to be strong demand for DTT services in most European markets. The loss of 700 megahertz spectrum, of course, squeezes capacity available to broadcasters, and even with prospects for technology upgrades in some markets, there's nonetheless a reduction there. And then for PMSE, alternative spectrum has been needed to try and replace the secondary access that was previously held in the 700 band. And to find that alternative spectrum is somewhat of a challenge, as I think we'll hear a bit later from one of our panelists, Andreas. And of course, this is a challenge that would be exacerbated if there was to be a reassignment of any sub-700 megahertz spectrum before 2030. Now, as for mobile services, in general, most of the widely talked about benefits of 5G, or at least the enhanced mobile broadband aspect, manifest themselves for larger spectrum blocks, and are therefore, perhaps as things stand, most relevant for bands above 2 or 3 gigahertz. That's of course not to say that sub-1 gigahertz spectrum is unimportant. Far from it. It continues to have a vital role to play in providing a coverage layer both for traditional voice and data services, but also for IoT and some of the 5G features that will be relied on by verticals. But with 800 megahertz and 900 megahertz already assigned, 700 megahertz in the process of being assigned to mobile operators in Europe, the question, I guess, becomes how much sub-1 gigahertz spectrum is needed. And for a basic coverage layer, arguably, the answer is not that much. That being said, sub-1 gigahertz spectrum is, of course, still very important. It helps to add capacity in the coverage layer, which is particularly important for providing 5G services in areas outside of cities. We have other bands too, on top of the ones I mentioned. So SDL in the 700 megahertz center gap and even the 1500 megahertz are being assigned in some parts of Europe. They definitely help, as do technological innovations like dynamic spectrum sharing, which allows more efficient provision of multiple technological layers. But with very large amounts of bandwidth available in the higher frequency bands, the proportion of network capacity that is coming from sub-1 gigahertz spectrum is shrinking. And that has implications for the consistency of data services across the network. And this was actually something that was discussed a little bit in Friday afternoon's panel on 5G connectivity, that in some ways the digital divide could be widened by all of the mid and high band spectrum coming to the market. So I think here a relevant question is, with the relative capacities on offer, does a bit more UHF spectrum fundamentally change these dynamics? So a point I'll come back to. If we could flick to the next slide, please. So the reliance on DTT is, of course, something that varies quite substantially between countries, both within Europe and more widely. And in markets where there's less reliance on DTT, the equation in terms of making the most cost-efficient use of this valuable spectrum is somewhat changed. I think this is true in parts of Region 1, most notably the Middle East, as we'll be hearing from Mohammed shortly, but also in Region 2 and 3. And in that context, we've seen some of the top end of that spectrum, so what's known as the 600 megahertz band, already being put to use in North America and being considered for use in other parts of the Americas and Asia. In particular, there's auctions planned, I believe, in Mexico and Colombia. Final slide, please. And the band plan being used in those parts of the world so far has been a 2 times 35 megahertz paired spectrum plan. And the good news is that this would most likely be compatible with the Region 1 700 megahertz band, which starts from 703 megahertz. And such harmonization with an existing band plan could, of course, be of great benefit, as we heard briefly from Mario from the Mexican perspective on Friday. However, given the demand and technology trends I've outlined, I think it's worth stopping to think whether this salami slicing, as it's often termed, of the UHF is the right long-term approach for Region 1. So firstly, there's a critical mass of spectrum required for broadcasting, and the more you chip away at that, the less able terrestrially delivered broadcasting is likely to be able to compete with other delivery mechanisms such as satellite or fiber. Secondly, while still valuable, further small blocks of spectrum like the 600 megahertz band might not offer quite the same substantial benefits of incremental sub-1 gigahertz as we've perhaps seen in the past to the mobile industry. Therefore, we might want to think about a longer-term coordinated decision across the wider 470 to 694 megahertz range. This could allow for larger spectrum blocks with less fragmentation and might, in the long term, be a more attractive option for mobile services. We could potentially think about a TDD configuration with large block sizes, or even, if we focused on downlink only, might there be a hybrid of SDL for mobile broadband with 5G broadcast that could have the potential to allow some European countries with less reliance on DTT to use that spectrum in a different way, and potentially even before 2030, because of the fact that cross-border interference might be easier to manage if we're talking downlink only, and this might allow DTT to continue as it currently does in countries that are more heavily reliant on it. These aren't easy questions, of course, and I'd argue that the UHF, therefore, is perhaps a very good example of an area where taking a bit longer to make sure we get to the right answer might have substantial long-term benefits over and above just taking quick and easy actions. With those introductory comments aside, I'd like to listen to contributions from each of our panelists in turn. Each will have around 5 minutes before we move to a question and answer session. So if I could start by introducing Jeremy Godfrey, who's the Commissioner at Comreg and Vice Chairman of BEREC. Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, everybody, I should say. It's a pleasure to be asked to speak here. By way of introduction to myself and to BEREC and Comreg, BEREC, I should just point out, is an organization of regulators. It doesn't have a spectrum management competence. Within Europe, within the EU, spectrum management is coordinated through the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, the RSPG. But BEREC does get involved in thinking about mobile markets and also in market shaping aspects of spectrum assignment. Comreg is a spectrum manager in Ireland, though. And personally, I'm probably not as technically expert as many of the other panelists, but what I'd like to share is some views on market issues. Thank you. So I'm going to start off by talking about the patterns of demand for mobile broadband, and I'll cover comment on some of the things that Mark had to say. So first, of course, there are three types of usage of the UHF band. There's mobile broadband, DTT, and PMSE. For mobile broadband, we've certainly seen growing demand for mobile data and that has intensified. We've seen intensification of that through COVID and through the greater working from home. Mark talked about what is the relevance of sub 1 gigahertz frequency. So I might share just one observation from the Irish market. We are in the process of auctioning off 700 megahertz and some other bands in a multi-band auction due probably early next year. And one of the things we've been thinking about in that auction is coverage obligations. And we've defined one of the coverage obligations we're proposing is that there should be a 30 megabits per second coverage obligation at the cell edge. And that is an obligation which we think people can meet through carrier aggregation. So one thing that I think sub-gig frequency can achieve is not just so much more capacity in the coverage areas, but also it makes it more feasible to require and greater speeds as part of a coverage obligation. So I think the sub-gig is potentially quite useful in providing higher speed services in the rural areas. And I know Mark talked about how the big blocks of spectrum available at higher frequencies are going to be more significant in mobile networks. But actually, I think in terms of digital divide issues, you need enough frequency in each area to provide the right speeds for the demand that exists. So in fact, I think the extra sub-gig frequency will be important to providing higher speeds in rural areas and could have a bigger impact on digital divide issues than might appear at first blush. When it comes to broadcasting, of course, there are two issues. One is viewership and the other is reliance on a particular technology. So we're certainly, I think, seeing viewership of linear television on a long-term decline. And a move as streaming services and video on demand becomes more and more popular. In Ireland, we actually have room for 6 multiplexes. Only 2 of them have been licensed. But notwithstanding that, public service broadcasting is an important policy priority in Ireland, as it is across much of Europe. And so one of the questions that arises is, what are the networks, what are the delivery mechanisms for public service broadcasting? And DTT is one of the mechanisms that is commonly used. In Ireland, it's probably makes up a smaller proportion of total viewership because of the popularity of satellite television. But I think, of course, there are alternative delivery mechanisms, and I think one of the main policy considerations is how do we make sure that public service broadcasting can be consumed by the people who need to consume it. And then finally, of course, there's a continued role for PMSE. In Ireland, that is driven, like as was saying, by visits from popes and presidents in the last couple of years. And then we also have golfers in the Ryder Cup and, of course, gigs. So I don't think we'd see the demand for PMSE changing. If I talk about some of the issues we see, one is that there's an issue with the coexistence of, one is to do with market mechanisms. So in the US, reverse auctions were used to determine the best use of the 600 megahertz band. In Europe, it's hard to see how market mechanisms on their own can be used to determine the best use of spectrum. Primarily because it's very difficult to put a value on public service broadcasting in an auction. When many of the broadcasters, many of the multiplex operators are state-owned, a reverse auction doesn't really work because it's the state is bidding is both receiving the money and making the bids for the spectrum. So there probably needs to be more of a policy type of decision about the use of the UHF band for broadcasting rather than using an auction mechanism. And the other thing that I find quite difficult to imagine is how a market mechanism could enable PMSE users to bid for frequencies where the users tend to be much more fragmented, much smaller. It's hard to imagine designing an assignment mechanism in which you could have an efficient way of PMSE users competing, say, with mobile operators for the same spectrum. Some other issues. Of course, coexistence of broadcasting and mobile broadband in neighbouring territories is quite problematic, and that leads to thinking that there really needs to be some good international coordination. It can't just be left to national authorities to determine what's right for their territory. So there's the famous example of Switzerland where UHF broadcasting has been turned off, but the frequencies can't be used for aren't able to be used for mobile because of the incoming interference from broadcasting from neighbouring countries. Another issue that I alluded to is the public policy priority given to public service broadcasting and the use of the DTT platform for that. That will vary from country to country because the political priorities will vary. And what the conditions should be for it being acceptable to turn off UHF broadcasting will vary. Some countries may decide that there must be affordable access over fibre or over universal high-speed broadband. Some countries may think it's okay as long as satellite reception is available, and others may essentially say no, there must always be a DTT option. So that will be an important and varied political debate from country to country. Another issue, which I think Mark also alluded to, is looking at the UHF band as a whole rather than continued salami slicing. So even for mobile broadband, we currently have guard bands and gaps in every 100 megahertz sub-block of the UHF band. That's inherently quite an inefficient way of managing the spectrum. It's quite interesting to imagine having a single large block for mobile broadband. Not only would that be make for efficient spectrum usage, it could quite easily, it plays to the availability of dynamic spectrum sharing, as Mark talked about, which also enables equipment to be retuned. So another learning from the Irish market, when the COVID crisis came along, the mobile operators approached Comreg and said could we assign some spectrum on a temporary basis so that they could have more flexibility to meet the increased demand. One of the bands that we assigned on a temporary basis was 700 megahertz. Nobody needed to go out and buy new equipment in order to make use of that band. The operators that had equipment that was already retunable and could be were immediately able to bring that band into use for providing 4G services in the 700 meg band. So we kind of see that if we had the band managed as a whole, it's quite efficient for the operators. It also creates some quite interesting possibilities for how we assign rights of use over time, because it no longer becomes the case that particular rights of use are associated with particular frequencies within the sub-gig band, are associated with particular investments. So one framework that might be a good way of thinking about this is to imagine the UHF band with broadcasting and PMSE at the bottom of the band, maybe on a primary basis, then a co-primary block for broadcasting and mobile broadband, and then a big block for mobile broadband. But obviously a big question would be, how big should each block be? And clearly the more that broadcasting can be corralled into a primary block at the bottom of the band, then the better the international coordination will be in using more of the band for mobile broadband. And finally, just a comment on timing. The decision for 2030 said 2030 at the earliest. I think maybe it's time to think of that as being 2030 at the latest for changing the use of the UHF band. A lot has changed, and a lot will change between now and 2030, and it doesn't seem probable that 2030 that what is optimal now will continue to be optimal up until 2030. So with the 2025 stock taking recommended in the Salami report, I think it would be a good idea to start that stock taking process soon, so as to inform the European position at WRC 23. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeremy, and some interesting points. We can definitely pick up on some of that again after the other panelists make their introductions. But if I move swiftly on to our next speaker, it's Mohammed Al Abdul Qadar, who's General Manager at Radio Spectrum Monitoring, coming to us from CITC, the Saudi Arabian regulator. Over to you, Mohammed.
Hello, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark. Hi, everyone. I hope everybody is fine and doing well. With regard to our topic, I think we all agree that the UHF spectrum is important to provide radio services in general. Concerning the subband, which is the 470 to 694, I think the situation is different from country to another country and from region to another region, where I think there is a need for harmonization and coordination to use the band efficiently. In my presentation, I would like to focus on the status of UHF in Arab region. If you can move to the second slide, please. So first, I would like to highlight the INT spectrum availability in Saudi Arabia. Before 2016, we had almost 270 megahertz of spectrum assigned to provide INT services, where it's only 70 megahertz of that spectrum is in sub 1 gigahertz, which is the 900 megahertz. We had like some issues in user experience. We had a average speed according to speed test 6 megabit per second, and we were ranked 105 in speed test. So the issue was not satisfying the people, was not satisfying the government. So extra efforts were done to evacuate the existing users from the IMT spectrum and to allocate additional spectrum to them. So if we can move to the second slide, please. So we had almost 4 auctions over 2 years between 2017 and 2019, and we have released 850 megahertz of spectrum. 80 megahertz of that is in sub 1 gigahertz, which is the 700 and 800 megahertz. So we succeeded to utilize the spectrum we had assigned for 5G services and also for 4G services. We had now almost 7,500 of 5G sites, and we have increased our speed up to 55 megabit per second, and we have a ranking 10th according to speed test. And we will not stop with this. We are planning to award additional spectrum in the future, 5 years, inshallah, in the sub 1 giga, and then the mid bands also, and then millimetric wave in addition to that. Can we move to the next slide? Concerning our topic, which is the UHF, we think that operators still needs more additional spectrum in sub-1 gigahertz in order to cover the rural areas and to penetrate in high density areas. So if we can say that the 700 and 800 is assigned to mobile operators where they provide 4G services there, we think that there is a need for additional spectrum in sub-1 giga to provide 5G services. And we saw this in the pandemic, in the COVID-19 pandemic. We have in Saudi Arabia received demands regarding the 600. Operators still, they ask for additional bands to provide the high coverage, or I mean, to cover the areas, the rural areas, and to penetrate. So what we have in sub-1 gigahertz, we have the band that is under study under agenda item 1.5, which is to review the existing usage of 470 to 960 megahertz, and to do possible regulatory actions in the band 470 to 694 megahertz in region 1. So if we can see the table, or the three tables here, we can see that in region 3, we have allocation for mobile service on primary basis from 470 to 960 megahertz. And we have some countries who have allocation or identification for INT services above 614 megahertz. So we think there is a possibility for region 1, especially for countries who are not utilizing the band efficiently for broadcasting services. Maybe it's different in Europe, but in other regions or countries in region 1, I think the status is different than Europe countries. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, here in this slide, I would like to highlight the Arab countries' status. So according to Plum Consulting report, they showed that people in Arab countries, they are demanding for free satellite in order to watch TV, while we have a declining in terrestrial digital TV from 2006 to 2018, and even we are declining more now, I mean 2020. In the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the status is the same. It may be more, I mean, in demanding for INT, and there is no, I mean, such receivers for broadcasting service. So people in KSA, they're watching TV almost 98% of homes, but only 1% of that percentage they are watching the TV using the terrestrial TV. Also, there are the IPTV, which we see that it's increasing recently. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Another slide about the Arab countries, according to the study made by Plum Consulting. They found out that up to 112 megahertz, between 582 to 694 megahertz, it's underutilized. No receivers there. I mean, most of the countries, we can say. People there not regulators, I think they have to see the possibility of using this band to provide INT services. Even if there is a need, how many multiplexes are needed for broadcasting? It will not exceed 5, maybe, if we can say, according to the study. Next slide, please. Another issue is that it's not about only TV. Now, recently we can see that there is a digital demand. There are digital channels. Netflix, other platforms are increasing. We can see from the graph that according to Statistic, that from 2020 to 2025, there is an increase of number of subscribers for these platforms. People are going to or moving to video on demand services rather than TVs and services like this. Next slide, please. Regarding the band from 614 to 698, we can see that recently there are international developments. There is an ecosystem in that band. We can see in the United States and Canada there were auctions for these bands. There are other countries that are planning to utilize the band for IoT services. From a regulator point of view, we think that a regulator, he must see or check the possibility of using that band for providing service. It's not only about service. Okay, it's allocated to, for example, broadcasting service. It's about how to utilize this band efficiently. It's a competing demand between services. We do not see in Arab region that there is a demand for broadcasting. So most of the Arab countries are demanding additional spectrum for INT bands and sub-1 gigahertz. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thanks for highlighting some of the important differences between Europe and the Middle East in terms of market demand, and we can pick up on some of those in a bit. Our next speaker in the meantime is Jaume Puyol, who's the chair of the policy working group at Broadcast Networks Europe, to give us a broadcasting perspective. Over to you, Jaume.
Okay, thanks, Mark, and good afternoon to everyone. And also thanks to Dan and all Forum Europe team for organizing this really interesting conference and for making us feeling a little bit more close to the normality after the COVID-19 crisis. Well, I'm here this afternoon to speak with you and to share with you the BNE, Broadcast Networks Europe view about the long term of UHF ban in Europe. We just heard about some of the Arab countries. Now we will speak about Europe. So a long future that, at least in the case of Europe, has been discussed and agreed 3 years ago and summarized on the UHF decision that you already commented. BNE members are heavily investing on the migration of the DTT services from the 700 MHz band in order for making the band available for mobile. So we are accomplishing the part of the deal. We are respecting this side of the deal, so it's reasonable to expect the accomplishment of the other part of the deal. And which is the other part of the deal? Well, is the sub-700 MHz band will be for broadcasting services, including free television and PMSA, until at least, no, it's not a maximum, it's a minimum, on the basis of national needs, while taking into account the principle of technological neutrality. If we can move forward, Dan, please, next slide. So, regarding the national needs, we have been hearing that the TV is dead for, I don't know, 10 years or so. Well, yet TV is still there, alive and kicking. For instance, a few days ago, we heard that Amazon is looking for having its own live TV channel in its service. So people is watching still the live TV. In fact, in Europe, more than the half of the Europeans, about 250 million of Europeans, we can say that there is no one watching, more than the half of the Europeans, are watching DTT for at least 3 hours and a half per day. 3 hours and a half per day. So that's the consumption. The demand is there, the demand exists. And also during these COVID times, we saw that the consumption of DTT has increased up to 6 hours per day. And the network providing these 6 hours of consumption of HD channels per day has been providing an excellent service with no sign of any congestion. Okay, so part of that, broadcasting services are also safe, as among others, they are a key tool for providing public media services, and also broadcasting services are also free because they are the cornerstone of the European audiovisual competition platform. Any spectrum change on the sub-700 will undermine this audiovisual competition in Europe. Next slide, please. As I said, in Europe, we already have the long-term agreement for the UHF, which is the UHF decision. In 10 words, 700 will be for mobile in 2020 plus 2 years, depending on the countries and on the case, in exchange for the access to the 700 MHz band for broadcasting services until at least 2030. Most of BNE members are investing on the 700 MHz bands. For instance, my company, we are making big efforts. We are allocating a lot of resources to migrate more than 7 national DTT layers into sub-700. So I'm sure that European regulators will find creative solutions that will cope with the agreement without undermining the investments that some of the companies are doing on the band. Also, during this this COVID-19 crisis, has been shown again that broadcasting services are, on one side, the most trusted source of information. They are provided by a resilient and independent network, and they are the best way for the administrations to reach all the citizens. Okay. The band is also a key pillar for the European audiovisual model, being also the strategic asset to keep their jobs and economic contribution. In fact, there is an interesting initiative in Germany where most of the political parties are pushing or are defending that UHF ban as the cultural ban for Europe, the ban where we have to promote the ban what we have in order to promote our European values. Next slide, please. And so, some facts about spectrum. Some figures. First of all, some figures. Broadcasting services are using nowadays 224 megahertz. On the other side, mobile services are using, or they can use in Europe, up to 1,200 megahertz today. That means 5 times more. But according to the latest WRC19 and so on, we know that more than 14 gigahertz have been allocated to IM3. And also, we learned those days during the Spectrum Management Conference that RSPG will harmonize about 12 gigahertz of spectrum for mobile. Okay, those are the figures about the spectrum. Then a few words about the sub-1 gigahertz golden frequencies, if we can call it this way. Well, to provide coverage and to reduce the digital divide, in Europe, we have 3 different bands. 900, used today for 2G, 800 megahertz, use it for 4G, and then 700, use it for 4G, 5G, we'll see, because now in the countries that where the band is available, and I think that it's not fully used. Well, now we are, or some are speaking about allocating a new band, the 600 megahertz bands, 2 per 35 megahertz of additional spectrum. I think that this band does not cope with any of the 5G use case that we are looking for the future. Regarding the enhanced mobile broadband, it cannot be provided using the typical and the historical FDD inefficient solution. We need other ways to provide this. Regarding the rural coverage, well, the need for 600 megahertz band for rural coverage in Europe needs to be demonstrated. In fact, for rural coverage, it's not a matter of more and more Salami slicings of the spectrum. It's a matter of more and more infrastructures. We need infrastructures to provide the rural coverage, not only more spectrum. Indeed, we have seen that some of the European administrations are reaching agreements with MNOs in order to expand the rural coverage. And these agreements, they are taking into consideration things like a license extension or renewals, CapEx compromises, these kind of things, but no new spectrum. Okay, a few words about the long-term view and the evolution of broadcasting services. Well, first, it's worth it to say that in the last 10 years, broadcasting services have passed from 10, more or less 10 national analog TV channels to 30, 35 HD interactive channels, more or less, using the half of the spectrum. So I do really think that the evolution is quite good and the track record is quite good. Also, but we are also looking at the future. We want to keep this evolution. For this, BNE is engaged at the 3GPP and actively participating on the definition of any possible future broadcasting technology, call it 5G broadcasting or whatever it could be. Okay, we are technological neutral, as it cannot be in another way. So, final slide, Dan, please. I'm finishing my remarks, but I would like to share with you some final thoughts. We expect lots of great things from 5G. And during this Spectrum Management Conference, we spoke about the role of verticals, or for instance, about the new ways of allocating a spectrum. And at the end, here, we are speaking again of the traditional FDD slicing on the sub-1 gigahertz again. So we can expect then the 500 megahertz will start in five years, the debate again. We don't really think that we should look forward, we should be creative, and we should find solutions for the future for all the European countries. From BNE, we are interested in any solution that would work under the UHF decision, the Geneva 06 plan, and using the band to provide downlink only services. That would allow countries to keep using DTT if they want, to roll out 5G broadcasting services if they wish, or to use both and in the current plan. So we do really think that with the current regulatory framework is flexible enough to foster innovation, to answer the needs of different European countries, and to keep the band as the European cultural band. For all of this, the European common position regarding the Agenda Point 1.5 and the WRC 23 should be no change, as co-primary is not the solution because it means exclusive access IMT in the end. Thanks, and looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jaume. Moving on to our next speaker, who's Ulrich Refus, who's the head of spectrum policy at Nokia, and today is representing the GSA. Over to you, Ulrich.
Well, thank you very much. I guess slides will come up in a second. So GSA, so on the next slide, please, quick overview. So we are representing the global mobile supply ecosystem now for quite many years. You may be aware of quite of the reports that we deliver. There's lots of research also available in terms of this Gambot database, looking into what devices are available for what bands. So for the GSA spectrum group, one of the major targets is harmonization, as ideally globally harmonization, but at least large regions to be harmonized to allow for cost-efficient implementation of bands, mainly in the mobile devices, but certainly also in the infrastructure. So on the next slide, a quick look at the role of the bands. I guess it had been touched by the previous speakers, but I think this role of low bands cannot be underestimated for, in fact, digital inclusion, for bringing services into the rural areas, also for bringing services cost efficiently from outdoor base stations to indoors, where indoor deployments are not economically viable. So low bands definitely play a role also in the further network extensions. So coverage nowadays does not only mean bringing a low data rate voice service and SMS into a particular place, but really bringing bandwidth into the place. And this is where also large RF bandwidths are absolutely required and make a lot of sense. So on the next slide, just a few considerations now specifically on below 700 megahertz. So there is an already harmonized ecosystem, 600 megahertz with FDD, with the band number 71 for LTE and band N71 for 5G new radio, which is widely supported in infrastructure and terminals. So there is an immediate option on the table where 600 megahertz can be introduced from coexistence perspectives, where there are policy targets and so on and so forth. And so we fully acknowledge and support certainly an interest, for instance, in ASMG on looking into such an option, as we definitely see this need for additional low band spectrum. So there had been mentioning earlier also of 5G use cases. For instance, there just is out a new report of the 5G AA, so the 5G Automotive Association, looking into their use cases and coming up with an estimate of 50 megahertz additional low band spectrum below 1 gigahertz for what they see as use cases. So coverage not only means remote homes, it means people on the road, maybe eventually in automated cars, that have time to consume whatever content is required. But we also certainly need to acknowledge the difficulties in releasing 600 megahertz FDD across the regions and sub-regions. So we've heard from the strong ASMG interest, and I guess there are parts in the ITU region 1 which would state the opposite, and in CPT we see a big diversity from country to country. Take two neighboring countries, so Switzerland has been mentioned, who have switched off their DTT entirely, and their neighbor country Italy makes massive use of DTT in the band. So how can we somehow account for this large diversity in interests, the different policy targets, in this balance of broadcast and mobile targets? So we believe it's still time left that we can look into different band plan options and to try to flexibly account for such regional specificities. So In the bottom of the slide, you see depicted this range of 470 to 694 megahertz. Probably it doesn't come as a surprise that the biggest challenge always is uplink protection. So when base station antennas on a rooftop need to be protected from the high power, high tower transmitters in the vicinity. So that typically has led to the requirement of clearing bands completely from DTT. So one thing one can really look into is what share of uplink and downlink is needed in the band. So an all downlink approach has been mentioned earlier in the discussion, or maybe asymmetric use, maybe partitioning in the bands. So this is, I think, where we just should have a fresh look. So what can we do in terms of providing coexistence between countries along a country border, and what can we even allow for in terms of flexible use within one country? So also the Pascal-Lamy report leading into the decisions of Parliament and Council for Europe not only talks about the protection of broadcast in 470/694 and PMSE use, but also the flexibility option, as typically broadcast use leaves a lot of space in every given country, in every given location. So while they require a frequency plan for a large band, there is lots of room in the band in any given location, where we can see if together we find solutions for more efficient spectrum use going forward. Thanks very much. That concludes my thoughts here.
Great, thanks very much, Ali. So on to our final panelist, who's Andreas Filzek, who's the Head of Spectrum and Innovation at Sennheiser, here to give us the PMSE perspective.
Yeah, hello everyone. So my job is mainly to give you some clues and glimpse on the audio PMSE sector in this game. So to be honest, we are basically sitting in between the shares. Yeah. So broadcast on one side and the mobile industry on the other side. So Sennheiser is a manufacturer of audio equipment. So here I will mainly talk about the audio equipment which is used in audio production for content creation. So broadcasting and also the mobile broadband are distribution channels for us. So for the content which is created by our customers. So next slide, please. So this slide is basically here to explain a little bit our view on the agenda item 1.5, which will be on the World Radio Conference. So the spectrum use and spectrum needs of existing services in the frequency band 470 and 960 megahertz will be reviewed in Region 1. And our duty as manufacturer is to contribute basically to the Working Party 5AC, which is in charge for the land mobile service, and wireless microphones belong to the land mobile service in this frequency range. But we also have some things to do in the Working Party 6A, because we are also services ancillary to broadcasting. We are lucky that for the audio PMSE, we have the ITU resolution 59-2, which is the work there is able to contribute to these two tasks, which are outlined to be given to the task group 6.1 after the working parties have concluded their work. And the deadline there is, of course, 15th May 2021 to deliver the information as required. So next slide, please. So to give you a little bit more clue what audio equipment in production is about. So I selected here some use cases which have all in common that they are everywhere by anyone and at any time. So independent of infrastructure which is deployed. The first one is live music. Yeah, so the live gigs with a lot of people joining this. And of course, also with the demanding requirements on the technology, because we here have source and sink in the artist of the wireless signals. So the wireless microphone and the in-ear monitor. Yeah, then we have electronic news gathering, yeah, which can happen ad hoc and in studios, and we have conferences which can use installed equipment, but also ad hoc. And then audio for video, so the video blockers, is just to indicate to you that we have more people now involved in content creation. Yeah, so think about YouTube, think about Instagram. So there are many, many things using audio equipment and video equipment. So depending on the use case, the demand for radio spectrum varies from some megahertz up to 230 megahertz. And of course, it varies also from the regions. Yeah. So for example, the Eurovision Song Contest, the decision which city is selected, yeah, depends highly on the available spectrum for audio and video production. So next slide, please. So on this slide, I basically want to present some things. Yeah. So first is we have various audio PMC ranges in the CPD region. Some of them are implemented on national basis, some are not. The 470 to 694 megahertz, yeah, is typically the spectrum which is available for PMSE, so audio and video, is between 4% and 30%, just depending on the location we have. The frequency range 470 to 865 is more or less the global tuning range of audio PMSE worldwide. The availability of equipment for a tuning range, of course, depends on the market. Yeah, so when the global market decides in a region that a frequency range is no longer there, yeah, then you really have the challenge that this equipment will not exist anymore. Yeah, so existence of equipment depends on the global availability of ranges, yeah, and of course the market size. So next slide, please. So it's quite clear that audio PMSE is a low power application, so typically 50 milliwatt. So our enemy, let's say, is in the performance, the receiver blocking. So we can't operate if there is a strong interferer close by. The advantage of coexisting with DTT in a band is that DTT is quite observable and projectable. So we always know where the channels are, and they are usually not moving around, which makes planning quite easy. So in the Radio X for region 1, we have a footnote available, which allows us on a secondary basis as land mobile service to use this frequency band. 84 out of 120 countries in region 1 signed this footnote, Arabian countries included. There are frequency ranges available which are harmonized in the European Union. These are duplex gaps at 800 megahertz and at 1.8 gigahertz. And there's this frequency range 1350 to 1400 and 1518 to 1525, which are gaining support globally by regulators and manufacturers to account for the growing spectrum demands. So our demands are not shrinking, they are growing. So next slide, please. Some words on the audio PMSE technologies. So the global market, most manufacturers of audio PMSE equipment make use of the European standard EN 342 as the baseline for the product development. There you have radio interface technologies ranging from narrowband, so analog or digital, typically using 200 kilohertz channel bandwidth, and upcoming wireless multi-channel audio systems, which are also digital, but employ wideband signal modulation. Audio PMSE specific technologies drive the innovation in the pro audio field. The driving factors are the audio performance, ease of use, and of course, the production workflows. Then certain audio PMSE applications have been realized using standardized wireless technologies. So the technology KPIs compared to the audio PMSE specific technologies are then not the driving factor. As these technologies are DECT, which is used today, it's DECT Evolution, and it's DECT 2020 to come soon. Since 2017, we are quite active in the 3GPP domain to bring up our research results and to embed them in the different standardization. But this is a long time to go, and we have some problems because the business models are not really compatible to each other, because the availability of 5G, for example, highly depends on the availability of the infrastructure in a suitable manner for the audio production. Thank you, and I'm keen on the questions which are coming around.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you to all our panelists for the introductory remarks. I think we can now move on to consider both audience questions and some questions that I have from listening to each of you talking. Plus, you may also have some interest in coming back in response to some of the things that each of you have been saying. We also have a couple of audience polls, which are I've just seen the results of and are quite interesting. So we'll talk about those in a moment. Trying to break the issues down, I think perhaps I can phrase this as first part of the question is perhaps, is there a mobile requirement for additional spectrum in the UHF? And one of our polls addresses this directly, and we can comment on that in a moment. Second is about, if there is a mobile requirement, what's the timing of that requirement for additional spectrum? Jaume and Jeremy, for example, you had different opinions on whether 2030 might represent the start or the end of a possible range of timings here. And thirdly, perhaps we could talk about the nature of any such requirement, whether more paired spectrum in the style of a 600 megahertz band is suitable, or whether we need to be thinking about an alternative arrangement with larger blocks, downlink only, for example. Across all of those 3 points, I think there's two sort of background themes that we can think about as we answer them. One is what happens to broadcasting and PMSE in each case? What's the impact there? Because clearly mobile demand is not something we can think about in isolation. And secondly, does the region, i.e. region 1, have to move as a whole in whatever it does, or can we think sub-regionally, for example, Europe and the Middle East doing somewhat separate things? Or can we even think on a national basis where countries like Switzerland are able to do something different to their neighbors like Italy, depending on demand for different services? And of course, this, as I say, will depend on the type of solution that we might think is preferable. But if I jump first of all to the start of that list, so is there a mobile requirement for additional spectrum in the UHF band? One of our audience polls pretty much directly addressed this. I believe the wording was, is there a need to find additional spectrum for IMT in the UHF band? And the answers are yes, there is an urgent need for additional spectrum, 17%. Not currently, but there might be a need in the near future, 36%. And no, 700, 800, 900 megahertz bands give enough bandwidth, 46%. So roughly speaking, we've got half the audience saying there is no requirement either now or in the, I suppose, medium-term future. And roughly half the audience that's saying there's either an urgent need or an upcoming need. Would any of you like to share your views on how soon you think there is likely, or whether there is likely to be this additional requirement for mobile and how soon it might arrive? Jeremy, you were mentioning, for example, 2030 could be seen as an endpoint.
Yeah, I think I agree with the results of the poll. I would say my first thing in terms of the kind of the consensus view would be, I think that there is going to be a need, but it's not here right now. And then with some discussion about just how, I think it is a bit uncertain actually, how soon you'll say it's absolutely necessary. But to my mind, I think the need, as I said in my introductory remarks, is driven largely by what quality of service can be delivered in rural areas. I think somebody had made a remark quite rightly that a lot of rural coverage is about finding locations for masts and actually rolling out infrastructure. That it gets you a service over a bigger area, but it's the quality of that service. And I think what we've certainly seen with the COVID and everyone working from home is that the need for higher quality services for everybody has become more important relative to getting better and better services for the favoured population that lives in the urban centres. So quite how those societal changes will play out in terms of driving demand that you'll need in what point of the next decade. So I think that's why I kind of said 2030 is probably the latest. It's 10 years is an awfully long time in our industry, and it's really hard to imagine that beyond 10 years we won't. If we conduct this poll in 10 years' time, people will be saying there's an urgent need if it hasn't already been satisfied. So the question is really how to go about that. And I think the Salami report stock taking exercise is the right forum to start exploring these issues. But of course, as you also said in your introduction, one part of it is when is the mobile demand going to happen? The other is how do you trade that off against the other needs for spectrum, for potential needs for spectrum, I should say, for broadcasting and for PMSE, and how easy it is to solve those problems is also part of the calculus.
Indeed, I mean, your initial point there that the poll shows a consensus for there needing to be more spectrum for mobile in the beyond the near term, I suppose. Yes, the poll does show that, but arguably it shows that less convincingly than I might have expected it to. Actually, 46% of people saying.
I don't know who the audience is, so
there will be some voting along party lines, I'm sure. But, yeah, Willie, it looked like you were planning to say something in the middle there.
Yeah, if I may. Yeah, indeed. We're talking about more than a decade if we push things beyond 2030. Anyhow, there is a review planned in this whole process 2025, which now may look a bit late from, at least influencing whatever Europe wants to propose and then maybe really promote in a World Radio Conference. I think one aspect really is, can we do things that don't harm one side while helping the other side? So far, I think it is a very confrontational approach. So mobile allocation, meaning clear the band, and I acknowledge that in the past it had been like that with 800 and 700 megahertz. So can we find new ways of reading what would a co-primary mobile allocation mean? Can we have DTT in one country remaining exactly as it is while the neighboring country can introduce a mobile service? And I guess they're looking particular at the downlink side can really help. Can we even have a mix of services within one country? I think much of that additional spectrum demand for mobile below 1 gigahertz is in the rural parts where there is no massive PMSE use, typically, maybe very few festivals excluded for a moment, but where you have this high demand for a Eurovision Song Contest, for an election. It's one location for a limited period of time in a densely populated area, typically. So regulators could find ways where certain 8 megahertz channels are protected for PMSE use in those limited locations, while they can be used in the countryside to improve the rural services. So I think this is where we propose to look into options, not just saying 600 megahertz yes or no, but really what options can we find? So that's maybe the plea, without giving any preference at this stage for any of the options. We're not there yet.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Jaume in a minute to ask about the downlink option, which was also mentioned in his presentation. But first of all, Andreas, I can see you're itching to come in relation to the rural PMSE requirements.
Yeah, so fundamentally, we have events which need to be in the rural area because there are simply not enough spectrum available in the cities. Yeah, so we already have the situations that some of our customers are complaining that they don't find enough spectrum, for example, in Berlin or when the October Festival is happening, which is in the city. The fundamental problem for the rural area, I think it's not about spectrum, it's about network densification. Yeah, so if there is no infrastructure available which can serve basically the rural area, I don't need the spectrum. Yeah, if I want to bring infrastructure into the rural area, I first need to bring, let's say, fiber to the rural area, because 5G depends on the network. Yeah, so cable-based network or a fixed service network. So you have an additional spectrum demand in order to basically connect the base stations. Yeah, and this is a challenge we see. Yeah, and for us, 5G is a topic, let's say, of connectivity of remote sites for event production. To basically bring the content then to the distribution. So we are interested in 5G, but for the production, we have the challenge.
Agreed. Xiaomei, if you'd perhaps like to come in on the downlink idea here.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Well, first of all, I must say that the idea of I would agree with the idea of that 10 years in our industry is a long period. For sure, I agree that in 10 years we will see 6, 7G, I don't know, whatever it takes. But in terms of a network, you must agree with me that the investment on the networks are long-term investments and they need some certainty. And as mobile networks, they need certainty. Broadcasting networks also need this certainty, and we're it on this. So I think that we need to stick on this. Regarding the needs of a spectrum of more spectrum on sub 1 gig, well, 700 is not yet used. So we'll see when it would be used in most of the European countries, I would say. Also, we do have the SDL band in 700 and in L band and so on. So there are other places of spectrum. And going to the SDO, well, the solution that we are trying to propose, or that we do think that it's good for all the sectors, trying to reach the win-win mentioned by Uli. It's a solution that allows countries that want to keep DTT, whatever they want, to keep it. Countries that want to introduce 5G broadcasting services, whatever it could be, they can. And countries that they want to use both, they can. So with the current regulatory framework understood as a flexible regulatory framework and working all together, we can do this. We can do this. So for this, we do really think that is the better approach.
Yeah, hi, Mohammed.
Yeah, if I can comment on this point, I think the situation is different from country to another country, and how much is the demand for the spectrum. From my point of view, I think the uplink coverage is the bottleneck here. There are use cases that require wide and deep coverage in both downlink and uplink. There are like IoT, there are some other applications that need uplink coverage. With both downlink and uplink, I think the MNOs can serve both broadcasting use cases as well. SDL band plan, as you know, is a non-standalone band plan that it means that MNOs need to combine it with another spectrum. And we don't think that there is a chance to repeat, the same exercise of 1.5 gigahertz. I mean, with the SDL and FDD and the full TDD spectrum. So we need to be careful, in utilizing that band. Maybe in Europe, it's a different story, but we think from Arab region point of view, there is no utilization. There is a kind of need of coordination with neighboring countries, of course, who are utilizing the band for broadcasting, since it's high power surface. So I think there are needs for the uplink even to provide the coverage for IoT service. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think there's two interesting points actually coming out of this that I'd love to get other panelists' views on. One is the need for uplink from the sub 1 gigahertz spectrum, and secondly is thinking about this idea of regional coordination. So if the Middle East were to go down one route, where does that leave Europe? Are we able to take a different path and go downlink only, while the Middle East perhaps moves in a direction towards the 600 megahertz band been seeing elsewhere? First of all, I suppose if we think about the first of those points, so the importance of uplink. Uli, Jeremy, do you have a view on whether constraining the use of the band to downlink only is getting the most out of it from a mobile perspective?
I maybe might comment. I think there's maybe a slightly longer term answer to that question, to do with, and it goes to do with whether we manage the UHF block as a whole versus all the Salami slicing. So one of the things I think that again we're seeing is that uplink is becoming more important than maybe we thought it was. I think we're probably all on this conference benefiting from fixed network connections, I hope, but certainly the other day one of my colleagues, his broadband was down and he was able to come onto our internal video conferences using his 4G connection. So the uplink is certainly a more important feature. There's more use of uplinks than there had been. So I think there's a question really of using the UHF band as a whole, rather than saying what's the most efficient way of using the 600 megahertz. So if we can have enough flexibility in the UHF band for the bit of the band that is shared between DTT and mobile being used in an efficient way that enables both, that's clearly a good thing. But it might then mean that to accommodate that, we had to use other parts of the band in a different way. So how long it would take before that became technologically feasible is something I'd leave to better informed colleagues. But but I certainly think that that clearly coexistence of different services in the same part of the band makes for a more efficient use of spectrum, and we should be looking for those opportunities.
Yeah, maybe to comment on the need for uplink, I guess that depends very much on use cases. So in the current networks, we see ratios of 10:1 and even higher if the traffic is higher, downlink to uplink. That is eMBB, that is maybe a few clicks and then the video comes downstream. If you look, for instance, to this 5G AA report, there seems to be quite some additional uplink spectrum requirement from their use case perspective. So that's probably something that also needs more investigation. Uplink is also important for higher bands, downlink, so to really get stable and balanced systems. So it needs a wider look. So that is maybe the pure demand look on the supply side. If you want, uplink causes some of the issues we're debating. So there may be good ways to really look at a set of bands together and what uplink capacity can be provided and what downlink capacity can be provided in a larger system, actually including maybe L-band or so, because that is what still can be served from a certain existing, let's say, site footprint, which also will be enhanced over time. Andreas, I agree, and needs further improvement. But I think we have very decent coverage typically in terms of voice and SMS today. We don't have decent downlink delivery capabilities when people want to stream a video in those places where they can make a phone call. So maybe that illustrates a bit why this additional spectrum can really help to make the cost-efficient improvements of those networks possible, where it's not possible to, let's say, have tenfold sites in rural areas, for instance.
Thank you. I'm being told that we have just under 5 minutes left, so I'm going to just move on to talk about some of the questions that are coming through from the audience. So the first couple here, both on the same theme, although coming at it from different angles. There's a question for Andreas about whether UHF spectrum is the only range that allows wireless production technologies to work as they do, or would it be possible to use VHF spectrum? And then very similar to that, but for Jaume, there's a question saying that, well, a comment, in fact, that says, I think discussion should not be IMT versus DTT demand. There'll always be this fight, which is present for the past 15 years. the discussion should be how do we move DTT to VHF. So I think perhaps there's comments for both of you to address there on possibility of use of VHF spectrum either as a complement or a substitute to UHF. Andreas, do you want to go first?
Yes. Yeah, so the VHF, we are continuously investigating this band, yeah, but we see a lot of man-made noise still, especially when there's an event. You have basically interference coming from LED boards and other equipment, yeah, so because this frequency range is unfortunately very close to the electronic devices which are used. Yeah, we see the situation somewhat improving, but still we don't see the same quality that we would have in the TV UHF band. Other frequency ranges are existing for PMC, yeah, but to be honest, the professionals are still in the TV UHF and they are there for a reason. Yeah, the reason is the propagation characteristic and the interference level we see there.
Yeah, agreed. And Jaume, coming to you, I imagine VHF is even more of a well, infeasible, frankly, for DTT. I would have thought.
Frankly speaking, let me say the following. For instance, from the technical point of view, VHF raster channels 6 megahertz, 7 megahertz is not enough for the European standard. We need at least 8 megahertz. There are no enough capacity to provide up to 30, 35, or even 40 HD, even UHD channels. We cannot use this. There is no enough capacity. Also, there are no antennas. We need to rebuild all the European households with new antennas in order to use VHF. I think it makes no sense. And at the end, from the technical point of view, also SFN. When you design a broadcasting network, you are reusing quite efficiently the channels. With the propagation of the VHF, you cannot do it. So you will lose a lot of capacity. You won't be able to provide this connection because remember that the DTT and also the European audiovisual model is based in local content, in the content that people feels close to them. If we are using such a kind of networks, we are not able to provide those contents. So it's not an option for us.
Thank you. Okay. So final question before I ask you all for a 30-second conclusion. That final question is from Joanna LeMay. It says, do panelists think that mostly using mid and millimeter wave bands for 5G will result in increasing the digital divide in most countries? This was a point I touched on, I think, at the start. I do think there, from my perspective, there is a risk of that, although Jeremy's made some good points as well about how you might use UHF in combination with other bands. Does anyone have any other thoughts to add on that?
Don't think about any new thoughts. Just say not necessarily. I think that you know, the whole thing about the reason why 5G has low band, mid band, and high band is that there are different patterns of demand, and you need different frequencies to meet that demand in different places. But inevitably, there's less density of demand in rural areas, and as long as you've got enough UHF spectrum to provide adequate services, then there's no reason why the fact that you've got different frequencies meeting the much higher density of demand in cities doesn't necessarily lead to a digital divide. But it could do. But you know, but the answer is not necessarily.
Relative density of demand versus amount of spectrum in the different bands, I suppose, at the end of the day. Okay, great, thank you. Could we close then by, if I ask each of you to just give a couple of concluding thoughts, 30 seconds or so each. Jeremy, if I come to you first, I'll go through you in the order I see you on the screen.
Okay. There's one comment from the audience that I quite liked, largely because it started with Jeremy Godfrey made an important point. But, but I might just repeat it, that from the point of view of broadcasting, what the broadcasters want is a secure way of reaching their audience. The technology used to reach that audience is maybe secondary, but it's an important, I think the question about could they move to VHF is maybe just maybe is a sideshow, but it's an example of that question. How do you provide a way to reach the audience? And I want to just make in the spectrum management conference, just to also make the observation that wires are also important as well as spectrum. So for the Eurovision Song Contest, for an indoor venue, you can imagine fibering up the venue, even using private 26 gig networks to provide connectivity for the devices. I know it's a question of making sure there's enough wire and enough base stations to enable that to be done. So I know that PMSC is always seen as the orphan child here, but I think there are many other solutions that can be considered.
Thank you. Mohammed, concluding thoughts from yourself?
Thank you very much. I think it's a great session in preparation for the WRC agenda item. I think there are different directions. I mean, there are some countries in the region who are utilizing the band for broadcast and others who are not using this efficiently. I think this session is very great, I mean, in preparation for the next, meetings in the ITU. Thank you.
Thank you. Jaume?
Well, thanks, Mark. 3 points. To provide more rural coverage, there is a need for more masts, for more infrastructures, not for more spectrum. Second, not all region 1, as has been said during this panel, not all region 1 needs to take the same approach. So let's be creative and let's find the solution that is good for everyone. And final thought, Europe. In Europe, there is demand for broadcasting services, and also we need to cope with the public service broadcasting also as an important thing for Europe. So for this, we do really think that there is no need for a co-primary on the sub-700 in the next conference agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ulrich?
Yeah, thanks also from my side. Well, for GSA, certainly mobile allocation is a very interesting topic. And also looking at the wider range, or the full band, not going in tiny slices, but maybe there are ways that actually both sides can benefit from that if broadcast wants to get mobile with 5G broadcast, and which then also does not harm those countries that want to stay maybe more conventional on what they currently have in DTT. And so the plea is just to widen the scope a bit, look into options. But certainly we would favor an evolvement into a mobile allocation. Thank you.
Thank you. And final word to you, Andreas.
Yeah, so I just want to remind that Geneva 06 is basically governing the frequency planning in the nations. And basically, I have the opinion that when a service has already a lot of spectrum, it's their duty to look for efficiency in their spectrum, which is already allocated, and not asking for others to get more efficient. Yeah, we are already squeezed out. Yeah, so we are at the channel bound.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for, I think, what's been a very good panel session. I'm sure the audience will join me virtually in thanking you. And Dan, I believe we're ready to close.
We are indeed. Mark, thank you very much. And to all our panelists, yeah, thank you all very much. That was a really fascinating panel. And thank you to everyone out there, because I saw that there was some quite detailed and heated at times discussion going on in the chat alongside the panel, which is great. So thank you all very much for your comments and questions. But most of all, again, to our panelists, that was a really interesting session and a debate that I'm sure will continue. But now it is actually your turn out there to get involved. So for all of you involved in or watching the panel, I should say, and who've been commenting, who've been leaving your comments and questions, then now's your opportunity to come and be part of the discussion, be part of the debate in person, because we're moving on to our Have Your Say session. So we're going to be moving into the sessions area of the platform using the menu bar on the left-hand side. Head into the Have Your Say room. And then if you did want to then bring your audio and video feed live, you can request to do that by clicking on the blue button saying, ask to bring audio and video live, strangely enough. So bring that. Please do come and join us down there. Come and become part of the discussion, and we can maybe continue this debate in that room there. So in the Sessions tab and the Have Your Say sessions, please do come and join us. But once again, thank you to Mark, thank you to all our panelists, and we'll see you in the Have Your Say session in just a second. Thank you.